On the night of December 3, 1977, a Soviet intelligence officer assigned to the Vienna Residentura failed to complete an authorized neutralization order. His target was an American national female, age 29, believed to be operating under diplomatic cover for the Central Intelligence Agency. Her code name in Soviet intercepts, Elm. The officer's name was Major Alexei Viktorovich Sidorov, Directorate S, Counterintelligence Division, Moscow Center. At 23:40, the Vienna Residentura lost radio contact with his line. At 23:46, he crossed into the neutral sector near Schottenring, carrying a falsified passport and a coded message in his inner coat pocket. The next morning, his apartment was found empty. His typewriter ribbon had been cut precisely in half. The last line, typed still visible through the carbon strip. Operation Complete Target extracted alive. Vienna, in 1977, was a city of divided languages and shared secrets. The hotels along the Ringstrasse overflowed with diplomats, defectors, and intermediaries. It was where the Cold War pretended to be civilized. Every coffeehouse was a listening post, every waiter a watcher. Major Sidorov had been in the city 3 years, posted officially as a cultural attaché under the Soviet trade mission. In truth, he ran surveillance networks across neutral Austria, informants, couriers, and disinformation agents feeding material to Moscow. His record was immaculate. 12 years of service. No ideological deviation, no emotional attachment, no family ties that could be leveraged. Until Elm. She had entered his orbit through the American Embassy's Cultural Exchange Program, a common recruitment ground for Soviet operatives seeking soft contact. Her real name was Katherine Moore, graduate of Georgetown University, fluent in Russian, officially a staff translator. Their first meeting was documented in Residentura logs. A reception at the Kunsthistorisches Museum, April 15, 1976. No direct approach recorded. No incident. Only an observation note, later appended by Sidorov himself. Subject displays non-diplomatic curiosity in Russian domestic affairs. Eyes steady. No nervous signals. It should have ended there. But within weeks, the surveillance team noted irregularities in Sidorov's routine. He began extending his field routes without explanation, taking the long way between safe houses. In his weekly cipher transmissions to Moscow, analysts identified subtle changes, rhythm shifts, delayed punctuation, small deviations invisible to a casual reader but glaring to professionals. The Lubyanka linguists called it emotional interference. By autumn, his superior Colonel Dmitry Solonitsyn, head of the Vienna Residentura, authorized covert observation. Hidden cameras were installed in Sidorov's assigned flat on Muna Gas. The footage from October 9th showed the following. 23:11. Door opens. Sidorov enters, removes coat. 23:12. Female enters, wearing dark coat and scarf, face partially obscured. 23:14. No verbal exchange recorded for 47 seconds. 23:15. They embrace. That moment, captured on grainy film, was later labeled the compromise. From that point forward, his fate was statistical. The party did not forgive affection. The KGB could not quantify love, therefore classified it as contagion. By early December, Moscow Center issued Directive 41-7V, Agent Sidorov, to confirm target's allegiance. Upon confirmation of hostile intelligence affiliation, neutralize. The order was clear. Neutralization meant removal, silent, efficient, without spectacle. He acknowledged receipt on December 2, 21-3. At 23:40, the Residentura lost him. What happened in the hours between remains reconstructed only from partial records and intercepted transmissions. According to later analysis, Sidorov met the woman in a safe house near the Nashmark district. The flat was one of the oldest Soviet properties in Vienna, officially registered to a deceased textile merchant since 1959. The heating had failed that week. The windows were iced from within. At 22:11, neighbors heard music faint, a record player repeating the same melody, Swan Lake, Act 2. At 22:47, one gunshot was reported by a street vendor closing his stall. Police found no casing, no blood, no body. At 23:08, Sidorov's emergency transmitter activated briefly, 1 pulse, 1 second. A code the Residentura recognized, Echo Return, meaning mission altered, outcome uncertain. When Austrian police later searched the flat, they found 2 wine glasses, both half empty, and a single photograph lying face down on the floor. The image showed Sidorov in civilian clothes, seated beside a woman whose face had been burned away with a cigarette. On the back, written in English, he said, "The state could not love me back." For 24 years, that photograph remained locked in the Lubyanka evidence vault. Only after the fall of the Soviet Union was it reclassified and connected to the missing officer's file. No record exists of Katherine Moore's departure from Austria. No trace of Sidorov was ever found. But 6 months after his disappearance, a message was transmitted from an unidentified frequency in the Tyrol region. It consisted of a single sentence in perfect Russian. "Report to center. Target alive. Allegiance changed." The signal was traced to a civilian radio tower. No operator identified. The voice was male. Analysis confirmed 92% vocal match to Major Alexei Sidorov. The file was closed in 1978, under classification, deceased in the line of duty. No honors awarded. No family notified. Only a final note by Colonel Solonitsyn, handwritten in red pencil. He chose the wrong country and the wrong heart. The Vienna Residentura, in the late 1972, was an invisible theater, built from whispers, suspicion, and routine. The city itself was a border in human form, half neutral, half compromised. Streets were lined with embassies and listening posts, cafes and cutouts, all pretending to be part of daily life. The Cold War played softly here, not with guns, but with glances. The KGB's local station, housed within the Soviet trade delegation on Reisner Strasse, was both embassy and machine. Dozens of names existed on paper, fewer in flesh. The corridors smelled of dust and ink. Doors were never closed, but conversations always were. Files moved in silence, carbon copies changing hands like secrets disguised as paper. No one trusted anyone completely, not even the comrades who shared their tea. Among them was Major Alexei Viktorovich Sidorov, age 38, linguistic operative, Directorate S. His cover identified him as a cultural attaché responsible for coordinating Soviet trade exhibitions in Austria. In truth, he handled surveillance grids, courier exchanges, and psychological assessments of foreign diplomats. He was an efficient man, precise, detached, and utterly loyal to the state that had trained him to feel nothing. He had joined the service young, molded in the discipline of Dzerzhinsky Academy, where emotion was a liability. Those who could not repress attachment were reassigned or erased. Sidorov excelled because he understood the grammar of obedience. His reports were perfect. His voice in transmission tapes carried the calm, flattened tone of a man who had learned to think in code. By the winter of 1976, that calm began to erode. The first trace appeared in his intercepted communications, a repeated phrase, "Weather in Vienna, improving." To a casual analyst, it meant nothing. To cryptologists, it was an emotional index, a signal of inner deviation. They noted it, filed it, and waited. Deviations always ripened into evidence. The evidence arrived quietly, disguised as a woman. Her name was Katherine Moore, an American national attached to the U.S. Embassy's cultural department. Officially, she organized art exhibitions and translated press releases. Unofficially, she fit every category of potential infiltrator, too fluent in Russian, too curious about the inner machinery of Soviet diplomacy, too calm around men who were trained to be feared. They met in April 1976 during a museum reception. The Residentura's camera captured nothing unusual. A handshake, polite conversation, a smile, but within weeks, surveillance logs showed that Sidorov's patterns had changed. He lingered longer in neutral zones, extended his field routes, altered his cipher habits. He stopped smoking the Russian cigarettes issued by the supply office and began requesting American ones, Kent, the same brand she smoked. No one confronted him at first. The KGB did not rush with suspicion. It allowed it to ferment. A loyalty test was prepared, cameras installed, his voice monitored even during radio silence. Vienna's winter grew colder, and the ministry's corridors mirrored that frost. Every movement he made was measured, every gesture catalogued. The analysts found what they were looking for in a recording made on October 9th. At 23:12, a door opened. At 23:14, two figures embraced. No words, just silence, long enough to confirm everything. From that moment, he ceased to be an officer in the eyes of the center. He became a subject. Official channels recorded nothing of what followed, but fragments survive in transcripts, side notes, and erased memos reconstructed from the magnetic residue of old tapes. The relationship deepened. He began to write her coded fragments of poetry, Russian translated into English, then back again. Words became their meeting place, safer than any street. Yet in a world built on paranoia, even love became a cipher waiting to betray its author. When a leak occurred in late November, American broadcasts, citing data from Soviet deployments in Czechoslovakia, the Residentura's patience ended. It was a simple calculation. Someone had talked, and the one most capable of talking was the one who had stopped speaking clearly. On December 2nd, Sidorov was summoned to headquarters. The meeting lasted 17 minutes. The transcript still exists. Colonel Solonitsyn's voice is steady, procedural. Sidorov's is almost absent, answering in single words. The final line reads, "The subject is confirmed hostile. You will act tonight." His reply, after an 8-second pause, was, "Yes." Analysts later underlined that pause in red, labeling it hesitation, inconsistent with duty. That evening, he signed out of the embassy building, coat buttoned, gloves immaculate, face expressionless. He walked into the city that had taught him both languages and lies. The snow fell in heavy, blinding sheets. At 22:03, he entered the safe flat near Naschmarkt. At 22:15, Katherine Moore followed. What passed between them remains unrecorded. The neighbors later told Austrian police they had heard music Tchaikovsky faint through the walls, then silence, then a single, muffled sound, too soft to be a shot, too sharp to be coincidence. At 23:40, his signal to Moscow activated for 1 second. The code translated as "mission altered, outcome uncertain." When agents arrived hours later, they found 2 wine glasses, a burned photograph, and no one left to question. The record ends there. After his disappearance, Moscow initiated the standard purge. The Residentura was dismantled, from within personnel, transferred, interrogated, replaced. Colonel Solonitsyn was recalled for consultation and never reappeared. The official report summarized everything in one sentence. Agent perished during counterintelligence engagement. Target hostile. Information leakage terminated. The rest was buried. Only a few analysts in Department K kept the linguistic traces, the reports where he'd written "weather improving," the minor irregularities in syntax, the single deviation that had betrayed him. They studied his fall as if it were a grammar error in a perfect text. One of them left a note in the margin years later, unsigned. He fell in love with what he was trained to destroy. Perhaps that is the truest form of treason. Vienna forgot him quickly. The Naschmarkt flat was rented to new tenants. The snow melted, washing away footprints that had never been meant to exist. But in a small Viennese shop near Kärntner Strasse, the tobacconist who once sold him American cigarettes kept one unopened pack behind the counter. He never sold it. He said a Russian man had bought 2 that winter, one for himself, one for someone he was not supposed to care for. When asked why he remembered, the tobacconist shrugged, because he said he would not need to come back. In December, Vienna's air thickened with a cold that seemed to carry weight, pressing down on the city until sound itself moved slower. The Residentura offices were always warm, the radiators hissing with excessive steam. But Major Alexei Viktorovich Sidorov felt cold from within, the kind of cold that came not from temperature, but from recognition that something irreversible had begun. He was still on duty, still reporting, still coded, still speaking the language of obedience. But those who watched him noticed the gaps, words left unsaid, sentences ending in silence. In the archives of Lubyanka, a linguist later underlined one of his transmissions and wrote, "Emotion audible in the interval between code groups." They called it interference of the heart. That week, KGB headquarters in Moscow authorized a secondary investigation, not to find him guilty, but to make him visible. Suspicion worked best when observed, like a chemical reaction. 2 officers were ordered to trail him under the guise of field assistants. One of them, Captain Leonid Arzamashtsev, kept a diary later confiscated by internal review. In it, he wrote, "He walks like a man whose shadow belongs to someone else." The first signal of compromise came from a postman, a civilian, unaware of what he had delivered. A letter addressed to Sidorov under his false name, Alex Berger, reached the embassy pouch by mistake. The envelope bore no stamp, no address, only a single word typed in English, Thursday. Inside was a page torn from a novel, Anna Karenina, chapter 14, with a faint pencil mark beneath one line. "If you look for perfection, you'll never be content." Sidorov burned the paper, but the smell lingered. His supervisor noticed the ash in the bin and reported it. From that moment, the Vienna station watched not an officer, but a man already being written out of his own file. Moscow's directives became sharper. Every message from Lubyanka began with "reconfirm allegiance." They asked him to repeat his loyalty oath during coded transmissions, a ritual humiliation disguised as security protocol. He obeyed. Each time, his voice flatter, slower. In one tape, you can hear the whisper of someone lighting a cigarette. The match flares. The words, "Pause." For 7 seconds, no one speaks. By then, he knew the Americans were also watching, not because of what they did, but because of what they didn't. The stillness of the embassy corridors when he passed, the way certain doors opened too quickly, or not at all. Catherine's behavior had changed too. She laughed less. She began to meet him only in places with noise bars, trams, concert halls, where silence couldn't be recorded. One evening, they met at a cafe near the Danube Canal. The fog outside glowed orange under the lamps. She arrived wearing a black coat and gloves. He said nothing for the first 5 minutes. Finally, she asked, "Are they listening now?" He looked around the room. "They always are. And you?" "I was trained not to listen, only to record." Her eyes softened. "You're not recording tonight?" "No." He lowered his voice. "Tonight, I am forgetting." The transcript recovered later from a surveillance tape caught only fragments cut by interference, blurred by overlapping radio frequencies. But one phrase survived clearly. "Sidorov, they told me to kill you." "More. And will you?" "Sidorov." Pause. "I don't know which side that would serve." They left separately. She walked north toward the opera. He took the tram to Schottenring and sat alone, watching the frost bloom on the window. When the tram stopped, he didn't move until the conductor asked if he was ill. He said he was fine. He was not. Within the Residentura, suspicion hardened into evidence. Someone had to write the report. Someone had to close the file. Bureaucracy demanded resolution. Colonel Solonitsyn, tired of Moscow's endless cables, composed one final memorandum. Agent compromised through emotional infiltration. Subject non-responsive to correctional pressure. Immediate action required. Recommend field solution. That phrase, field solution, was the euphemism for disappearance. Sidorov received the order through official channels, coded as Operation Renewal. He was to meet the target at the safe house one last time, confirm her status, terminate, deliver proof. Simple words, the same way all killings were written, neat, grammatical, bureaucratic. He did not refuse. He merely delayed. For 2 nights, he avoided his handlers. He walked Vienna's streets until dawn, through empty parks and frozen markets, as if trying to memorize the city's silence. In his pocket, he carried a small radio transmitter disguised as a lighter, his final line to Moscow. He never used it. Instead, he began writing in a notebook, something rare for him. The entries, recovered later, were more confession than report. They trained us to manipulate meaning, but love is not meaning, it is interruption. I cannot decide whether to obey or to live. The cold has no language. The notebook was never sent. December 7th, 1977. The KGB's internal surveillance unit sent an urgent cable to Lubyanka. Agent possibly defecting. Preparations for interception underway. That night, he met Katherine for the final time. The apartment on Mulnagas was stripped bare. No photographs, no documents, nothing to suggest life. She stood by the window, watching the snow fall on the street lamps. "You came," she said quietly. "I was ordered to." "Then you'll do it?" He looked at her for a long time before answering. "No, they were right about one thing. Emotion is infection. You infected me." She smiled faintly, the kind of smile one gives before disappearing. "Then, we're both sick." He told her they needed to leave Vienna, that he could reach a contact in Graz who could arrange passage through Italy. She didn't answer. Instead, she handed him an envelope, a forged Soviet diplomatic passport bearing his photograph under a new name. "Where did you get this?" "I have friends too," she said. "Not all of them wear your flag." The record states that they left the flat at 22:30. At 22:47, a gunshot was reported nearby. Police arrived 10 minutes later. The building was empty. When the Vienna Residentura analyzed the scene, they concluded she had been shot by local operatives during attempted extraction. No body was found. Only the glass from the window shattered outward, not inward, suggesting she had been near it when the bullet came. Sidorov's coat was gone, his documents gone, his service pistol missing. At 23:08, his transmitter pulsed once. 1 second. Message code, echo return. Then, silence. In Moscow, panic turned to procedure. The ministry convened an emergency committee to rewrite the narrative. Failure was forbidden. Therefore, failure had to be rewritten into loyalty. The new report read, "Agent Sidorov perished, preventing unauthorized defection of hostile operative. Mission accomplished at cost of life." He was declared dead. His pay records terminated. His personnel file sealed. But inside Department 8, which managed linguistic forensics, a copy of his transmissions was kept for study. The analysts dissected each phrase, each pause, each breath. They charted his descent through grammar, from obedience to confession. One concluded that love had a syntax, and he had followed it perfectly to his own destruction. Months later, in a Moscow training lecture for new recruits, an instructor presented the case of Officer S as cautionary material. The voice on the recording was played at half speed. "Listen," he told them, "to what it sounds like when ideology begins to melt." They listened, and in the slow distortion of tape, they heard something like breathing. The official version ended there. Unofficially, the case continued to echo through the network of residenturas like a superstition. Agents whispered of hearing his voice in coded transmissions, a line that appeared once in 1978, again in 1981, always on empty frequencies, weather improving. Linguists at Lubyanka dismissed it as coincidence, a residual loop in outdated encryption protocols, but others weren't so sure. One analyst wrote in the margin of a report, "Some ghosts travel by radio." In Vienna, no one spoke of them again. The Americans filed no missing persons report. The Soviets denied everything. The apartment on Mulnagas was repainted, its walls covering the bullet holes beneath plaster. But the landlady, years later, swore she could still hear faint music in the room on winter nights. When asked what kind, she said, "It sounded like Tchaikovsky, but slower, almost like someone remembering it rather than playing." The last entry in the internal KGB dossier on Sidorov reads, "Subject emotionally nullified. Operational value exhausted. File closed." Yet the very next line, typed by a clerk who likely never knew him, contradicts it. Status unresolved, awaiting confirmation. That line remained uncorrected for 20 years. The truth, when it finally reached Moscow, arrived not as revelation, but as inconvenience. It came folded inside an encrypted memorandum from Department K, dated March 1978, stamped "Psychological Counterintelligence Experiment, Internal Use Only." It revealed that the woman known to the Vienna Residentura as Katherine Moore had never belonged to the CIA. She was, in fact, one of theirs. Her real name was Ekaterina Morozova, born in Minsk, trained at the Red Banner Institute under the alias American Cultural Translator. Her assignment had not been espionage, but observation. The objective, to evaluate the limits of emotional deviation among KGB officers stationed abroad. The test had a code name, Project Winter Veil, and Sidorov had been its subject. He had never been meant to survive it. The program's logic was bureaucratic, cold, perfect in its cruelty. The committee feared that field officers stationed for long periods in the West would develop empathy, the most dangerous form of contamination. Rather than wait for failure, they decided to manufacture it. A controlled collapse, safe, measurable, instructive. They selected agents with exemplary records, those considered incorruptible. Each was paired with a fabricated foreign contact, created and managed by internal counterintelligence operatives posing as Western assets. The relationships would progress naturally, observed through wiretaps and reports. When the emotional compromise occurred, Moscow would study it, document it, terminate both subjects, and log the result as behavioral data. Sidorov had been the third experiment. He was the first to refuse his order. The woman, Ekaterina, had performed her part precisely. She was trained to mimic sincerity, to mirror his speech patterns, to reflect vulnerability. Every letter she wrote to him passed first through the Residentura's psychology unit. Even her favorite music, Swan Lake, was chosen by scriptwriters at Department 12 because it tested nostalgia responses in male agents of Sidorov's generation. But something unmeasurable happened. The experiment exceeded its parameters. She stopped filing reports. The last report she sent to Moscow, 2 days before the disappearance, contained only a single line. "He believes I am real. I am beginning to believe it too." After that, she vanished. Inside Lubyanka, panic was not an emotion, it was a protocol. The directorate responsible for the experiment destroyed all references to Winter Veil and ordered the deletion of her personnel file. But copies survived, in fragments, scattered through accounting ledgers and travel vouchers. One fragment bore her photograph, black hair, dark eyes, expression neutral, the kind that could be anything anyone needed her to be. The internal post-mortem lasted 3 months. It concluded that both agents had been contaminated by exposure to uncontrolled affection. The memo's language was precise, detached, clinical. Emotional transference achieved. Subject A, male, failed to execute termination order. Subject B, female, compromised mission integrity through sympathetic response. Outcome: mutual disappearance. Recommend discontinuation of experimental series. The recommendation was ignored. For years afterward, the project continued under different names: Autumn Mirror, Quiet House, Glacial Reflex. But those files belonged to other men and women, other ghosts. Sidorov's case became myth. The lesson it taught was repeated in training halls, though never officially acknowledged. The officers were told, "Your heart is not your own. The moment you feel it, it belongs to the enemy." Yet, somewhere within Department 8, a low-ranking archivist refused to erase his transmission tapes. He kept them, unlabeled, in a locked drawer. Years later, during reorganization, the tapes resurfaced. When played, they revealed not just operational codes, but fragments of conversation, stripped of context, but heavy, with something untranslatable. Sidorov, they want us to be function, not human. Ekaterina, and yet you still say my name. Sidorov, because it's the only thing not written for me. The recording ends with silence, then faint music, the needles scratching over a record's final groove. When the transcripts reached the Psychological Research Division, the analysts argued whether the emotion was genuine or induced by proximity. One wrote, "We cannot determine where the act ends and the man begins." Another replied, "Perhaps that distinction no longer matters." By 1979, Winter Veil had been officially purged from the archives. Yet, like all erased things, traces survived. Memos without subjects, letters without senders. Among them was a single envelope addressed only to Department K, for whomever remembers. Inside, a photograph. A man and a woman in civilian clothes, seated on a park bench, both looking away from the camera. On the back, in Russian, someone had written, "We were loyal, just not to the same thing." The handwriting matched neither Sidorov's nor Ekaterina's, possibly a field officer, possibly no one at all. In later debrief sessions, when the operations architects were asked what had gone wrong, the responses were identical. Nothing. The experiment, by their measure, had succeeded. It had proved that love could override protocol, that loyalty could be redirected, that even perfect agents could be rewritten by the illusion of choice. What disturbed the committee was not their defection, but the disappearance of both bodies. Vienna's local authorities reported no evidence of deaths, no border crossings under their names. To the KGB, this absence was intolerable. A missing corpse was a living story. Rumors emerged that a truck driver crossing into Hungary saw two travelers on foot near the border, walking through the snow. He remembered the man's accent, Russian, but softened, uncertain. The woman wore no hat. He offered them a ride. They refused. She was smiling, he said, but in the way people smile when they have already lost. The report was filed, then dismissed. In the early 1980 seconds, a Soviet signals officer stationed in Bratislava intercepted a shortwave broadcast in Russian. It was faint, low frequency, buried beneath commercial music. The transmission repeated twice. Winter Veil intact. Report unnecessary. The message was logged, decoded, then erased. Somewhere, an old analyst who had once studied Sidorov's syntax noted the rhythm of the voice. "If you slow it down," he said, "you can hear him breathing between syllables." Decades later, the declassified appendices would reveal the part no one in Moscow wanted recorded. Ekaterina had not been the first woman assigned to him. Two others had been tested in controlled encounters at embassy functions. Both failed to provoke any emotional response. Only when they used her, a native Russian trained to sound American, did the mask begin to crack. The conclusion was cruel in its simplicity. Familiarity breeds trust faster than ideology. They had built her precisely for him. She had been engineered to be the only person he could love. In an unsigned postscript attached to the file, possibly added by an analyst during the 1980 seconds, one final observation remains. We sought to test the fragility of the human instrument. Instead, we discovered that even when both sides of an equation are written by the same hand, the result is never predictable. The language of loyalty has grammar, but not logic. The file ends there. But one rumor persists, unproven, whispered through corridors long after the Soviet flag was lowered. It claims that years after the operation's closure, a defector interviewed in Zurich mentioned a man working under an assumed name in a local radio factory. He spoke little German, carried a Soviet lighter, and hummed classical music while assembling parts. When asked what kind of music, the defector said, "Swan Lake, I think. Always the same part, the one where she falls." No document confirms it was him. No record of her burial exists. Only the code name remains, written on a yellowed folder in Lubyanka's sub-basement. Operation Winter Veil. Results indeterminate. It is the only file in the archive, stamped with two contradictory seals, success and failure. They met again in snow. It was the border between countries that did not want them and skies that could not remember where they had begun. The train had left them miles behind the checkpoint. Only a frozen field and a single telegraph line crossed that place. To the east was the empire that had made them. To the west was air that had no language. Sidorov carried a pistol he had never intended to use and a passport that would not survive inspection. She carried nothing at all. The radio hidden in her coat pocket was dead. The last battery had frozen hours before. They walked until the sun sank into a horizon made of tin and silence. At dusk, headlights appeared in the distance. A single car, black, state issue, moving without hurry. He knew before it stopped that it would be them. The door opened. Colonel Solonitsyn stepped out. The cold turned his breath into smoke, the same color as the gun in his hand. Behind him, two men waited without faces, only outlines in fur hats. "Major," Solonitsyn said, "you've gone far enough." Sidorov said nothing. The woman stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The colonel's voice was even bureaucratic, as if reciting from a manual. "You were never meant to reach the border. You were never meant to believe she was real. This was the lesson. You failed to learn it." Sidorov asked, "And what are you now, Comrade Colonel? My teacher or my executioner?" Solonitsyn looked at the woman. "She was never yours to save. She was ours to test." For a moment, the only sound was wind scraping across the ice. Then she spoke. "It's true," she said. "They sent me to measure you. I thought I could do it, but I changed. I stopped reading their instructions. I started reading your eyes instead." Solonitsyn's hand tightened on the pistol. "Sentimentality is treason," he said. "You of all people should know that." Sidorov stepped between them. His voice was calm. "Then what is loyalty, comrade? A machine that kills its own reflection?" Solonitsyn raised the weapon. "Loyalty is silence." The first shot split the air, but missed. The second tore through her coat. She fell without sound. Sidorov knelt beside her, pressing his hand against a wound he could not close. Blood bloomed through the snow like ink in water. She whispered something he could barely hear. Later, he would try to remember the words, but all that remained was the rhythm, not the meaning. When he looked up, Solonitsyn was gone. Only the car remained, idling, waiting for no one. He lifted her body, placed it in the back seat, and sat beside her. The keys were still in the ignition. The car drove west until the fuel ran out. He left it by a river and walked until dawn. At Lubyanka, the report of the confrontation was rewritten before it was read. "Subject executed hostile operative," it said. "Mission successful." There was no mention of the colonel, no mention of the woman, no mention of the border. The state could not record contradiction. It could only record outcomes. Weeks later, a patrol found the car near the Danube. Inside, no bodies, only the pistol, a torn passport, and a single reel of magnetic tape. The tape contained 7 seconds of sound, wind, distant water, and a voice repeating one phrase. "She is gone. I remain." It was not clear whether the voice belonged to him or to the machine. Moscow classified the file, closed, subject terminated in field action. But small details betrayed uncertainty. The death certificate bore no signature. The stamp bled red into the paper, as if pressed too quickly. In the margin of one internal memo, a clerk had written in pencil, "No body, no certainty." For months, the ministry received untraceable shortwave signals along the Austrian border, snatches of Russian words, broken frequencies, fragments of music. Analysts dismissed them as static. Others said they were listening to a man who refused to disappear. One night, a technician recorded a clearer fragment. The voice was male, tired, precise. Loyalty rewritten, test complete. Then, silence. The signal never returned. The colonel's fate followed quickly. Officially, he retired due to illness. Unofficially, he was interrogated for mismanagement of a classified operation. He died in 1979, apartment sealed, possessions confiscated. Among them was a small wooden box containing 2 items, a broken radio transmitter and a photograph of a man and a woman sitting on a bench. The caption on the back, written in English, read, "Vienna, Spring." When the archivist catalogued it, he noted that the photograph appeared twice, once in Solzhenitsyn's effects and again in the Winter Veil file, the same image, 2 different provenances. As if the system itself had begun to copy its memories. By 1980, the affair had turned into instruction material. At the Dzerzhinsky Academy, cadets were shown a redacted version of the file. The instructor explained the official moral: never confuse assignment with affection. Yet in the silence that followed, the cadets listened differently. They heard the unspoken, the sense that the man in the story had crossed not a border, but an idea. That night, in the academy dormitory, someone wrote on a blackboard before lights out, "He loved, therefore he vanished." No one erased it. In 1983, during a restructuring of the psychological directorates, a young researcher reviewing archived magnetic tapes stumbled on one labeled only "Audio Artifact, Vienna." She played it. It was a recording of a field radio looped endlessly. The sound was faint, rhythmic, and beneath the static, a woman's voice could be heard whispering a phrase in Russian. They wanted an experiment. We became the result. The researcher filed a report and never spoke of it again. The tape was lost during the next audit. Outside the archives, the story of Sidorov turned into rumor. Truck drivers in Hungary claimed to have met a Russian who worked in repair shops, a quiet man who spoke little, always carried a lighter engraved with the letters VV. He never gave his real name. When asked about his past, he said only, "I used to listen for a living." No official record supports this. Yet, years later, in a hotel registry from 1987, there appears an entry written in Russian cursive, signed A. Viktorovich. The next morning, the room was empty, the bed untouched. On the desk lay a half-burned photograph of a woman standing beside a river. On the reverse, in English, "Perfection does not exist." The Cold War ended, and the empire dissolved. Files opened, redacted names became public, but some pages remained blank. Winter Veil was one of them. Its final annotation, dated 1992, reads, "No surviving subjects, no further study authorized. Phenomenon concluded." But in the postscript written in another hand, darker ink, a different sentence appears. Phenomenon continues. Language remembers. In 1995, an American intelligence officer visiting Moscow as part of an exchange program requested access to Cold War archives. Among the documents shown to him was an unmarked file containing a single letter typed in English on Soviet paper. The letter had no date, no address, no signature. It read, "If they ever find this, tell them the experiment succeeded. We learned that the only way to survive the machine is to become a ghost inside it." The officer photographed it. The image circulated quietly among linguists and historians, a digital echo without origin. By the time the file was formally declassified in 2003, almost nothing remained except copies of copies. Each document bore small distortions, words replaced by similar ones, syntax slightly altered, as if the text itself had begun to translate its own history. On the final page, beneath the official summary, there was a faint line, visible only under ultraviolet light. "She is gone. I remain." The archivist who discovered it filed no report. He simply closed the folder and returned it to the shelf. Some nights, when the power flickers in the lower levels of Lubyanka, staff claim to hear faint transmissions in the old frequency bands. The pattern is always the same: 3 bursts, then silence. The engineers who maintain the equipment say it's interference from old wiring, but those who have listened closely insist the signal carries words, the same phrase, repeated endlessly, almost swallowed by static: "weather improving." In the spring of 2002, the Lubyanka archive was quiet. The dust was layered so thick that the labels on the old steel cabinets looked as though they had grown there, part of the metal. At night the building groaned, like something that remembered too much. Dr. Irina Mikhailovna Levin, a linguist from the New Historical Memory Institute, had been granted access to review psychological operations material of the 1,970 seconds. She expected training pamphlets, propaganda drafts, nothing more. The clerk who led her down the corridor spoke without inflection, as if reciting a prayer he had repeated too many times. At the end of the hall, he stopped before a door marked only with a faint number, 241 to 77. Inside, the light was yellow and soft. On the table lay one thin folder, unmarked, beside a reel of tape so old the oxide had begun to peel. She threaded it through the player, pressed play, and waited for sound. Static filled the room first, a whispering sea, then a voicemail, Russian, tired. "Weather improving." The tone was calm, without fear. Then, softer, "She is gone. I remain." The tape ended there. She rewound it, played it again. The same. She made a transcript, wrote her notes in the margin, but each time she looked back, the words on the page were slightly altered, verbs shifting tense, syntax rearranging itself. The sentence, "She is gone. I remain," became, "She was gone. I remained." Then, "She will be gone. I will remain." The text seemed to resist being fixed, as if the story had decided not to end. When she asked the archivist about the file, he shrugged. "One of the ghost cases," he said. "It writes itself every few years. We stopped trying to catalog it." Later that month, she found the name Sidorov buried in a metadata tag on an old magnetic index. No file attached, only a checksum, an electronic fingerprint. When she traced it, the trail led to a server that hadn't been connected since the 1,980 seconds. The technician reactivated it for her. The monitor glowed to life, lines of code flickering across the screen. Each line was a fragment of translation, Russian to English, then back again. The same words repeated with minor variations. "We were loyal. We were useful. We were written to vanish." When the translation program reached its end, it printed one final sentence in English. The screen flickered, letters forming slowly, as if being typed from somewhere far away. "She forgave me." The machine froze. No operator command had generated that text. The technician swore softly and shut it down. They left the room without speaking. Weeks later, Dr. Levin presented her report to the Institute. She called it the Sidorov Artifact, Residual Syntax in Cold War Archives. The committee dismissed it as an error of transcription, an algorithmic ghost. The official note read, "Anomalies consistent with degraded data. No further study warranted." But at the end of her paper, she added one paragraph the committee later deleted. Perhaps the experiment succeeded after all. The language learned to survive its speakers. What the committee tried to destroy has adapted. It hides now, between translations, repeating itself in forms no one designed. she never published again. In the years that followed, fragments of Operation Winter Veil appeared across digital archives, small textual mutations embedded in unrelated documents, an embassy memo, a scanned diary, a line of code. Each contained the same subtle pattern of phrasing, the same grammar, the same deliberate precision. Scholars studying these artifacts began to call it the Sidorov cadence. No one ever proved authorship. Some believed the algorithm that digitized the archives had absorbed fragments of his transmissions and was replicating them unconsciously. Others whispered a simpler theory, that the man who said weather improving had found a way to remain not in body, but in language. In 2005, an American journalist visiting Moscow asked a retired KGB officer whether he remembered the case. The old man smiled faintly and said, "You mean the ghost who loved an experiment?" "Yes, he made the mistake of believing words can save people, but words only remember them." He paused, then added quietly, "The last time I heard that frequency, it was not static, it was breathing." The file V241-77 now rests in a sealed cabinet marked Access Restricted. The tape has decayed beyond playback. Yet every few months, when the building settles at night and the old network cables hum, the archivists claim to hear the faint crackle of a transmission moving through the lines. Always the same message, always in the same voice. Weather improving. Then, after a pause long enough to suggest thought, "She is gone. I remain."